I am your host, Miss Marple. Let's begin our journey.
The village of Chipping Deeping was the sort of place where the passage of time was measured not by clocks, but by the blooming of the laburnum and the rotating flavours of the month at the local creamery. It was a village of steep gables, well-manicured lawns, and an almost competitive level of neighbourly silence. Miss Jane Marple, staying with her old friend Alice Fanshawe at Willow Cottage, found the atmosphere pleasantly reminiscent of St. Mary Mead, which is to say, she found it ripe with the potential for human error. The occasion for the village's gathering was the centennial celebration of the Chipping Deeping Library, held on the sprawling, slightly overgrown grounds of Willow Cottage. Alice, a woman of exuberant energy and questionable organizational skills, had invited the entire local set. There was Sir Geoffrey Thorne, a man whose family had owned half the county since the Restoration, and whose face currently resembled a very upset tomato, his younger, far more elegant wife, Lady Elena, and the village's newest resident, a brooding historian named Marcus Vane, who had moved into the old mill to write a definitive history of the area's lost lineages. Miss Marple sat in a wicker chair under the shade of a weeping willow, her knitting needles clicking a soft, rhythmic staccato. From this vantage point she could observe the social choreography of the afternoon. She noticed how Lady Elena avoided the gaze of Marcus Vane, and how Sir Geoffrey's hand tightened around his silver-headed walking stick every time the historian laughed. It was a familiar dance, the tension of old money meeting new curiosity. "It is quite remarkable, is it not?" Miss Marple remarked to Alice, who had fluttered over to check on the lemonade. "How much one can learn by simply watching the way people hold their teacups. Sir Geoffrey is quite agitated, dear. He reminds me so much of poor Mr. Badger from the village, who was always so terrified someone would find out his grandfather had been a circus performer." Alice laughed, though her eyes remained anxious. "Oh, Geoffrey is just protective of his family name, Jane. Marcus Vane has been digging into the old parish records, and you know how people hate having their ancestors dusted off. Marcus claims to have found a Willow Cottage secret that will change the history of the Thorne family forever. He's supposed to announce it after the toast. The toast never came. As the sun began to dip behind the elms, Marcus Vane stood atop the small wooden dais, a leather-bound journal clutched in his hand. The village chatter died down, replaced by a heavy, expectant silence. He looked out over the crowd, his expression one of grim triumph. "I have spent 3 years looking for the truth about this village," Marcus began, his voice clear and resonant, "and here, at Willow Cottage, I have found the missing link in the Thorne succession. It is a secret that has been kept for 100 years, a secret that—" He stopped abruptly. His face went from pale to a ghastly bruised purple. He clutched his throat, the journal slipping from his fingers and thudding into the grass. For a moment he stood there, swaying like a tree about to fall, his eyes fixed on Sir Geoffrey with a look of profound, silent accusation. Then, with a strangled gasp, he collapsed forward, his body striking the edge of the stone sundial with a sickening crack. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the distant, indifferent song of a blackbird. Then chaos erupted. Lady Elena let out a sharp, piercing shriek, and Sir Geoffrey stepped forward, his face now a mask of rigid, unnatural calm. Dr. Arbuthnot rushed to the fallen man, but the stillness of Marcus Vane's body told the story before the doctor's hand even touched his wrist. Miss Marple did not move from her wicker chair. Her eyes were not on the body, but on the grass where the leather journal had fallen. She watched as a small, silver-haired woman, the local librarian, Miss Treadgold, quickly stepped forward, and, with a movement as fluid as water, nudged the journal into the shadows of the willow tree with the toe of her sensible shoe. "A very untidy way to handle a secret," Miss Marple whispered to herself, her needles finally falling silent. "Exactly like the business with the apothecary's daughter. When you try to bury the truth in a garden, you should never be surprised when something quite different starts to grow. The centennial afternoon had ended, but the mystery of Willow Cottage had only just begun. The shadows of the weeping willow seemed to lengthen with an unnatural haste, casting long skeletal fingers across the manicured lawn of Willow Cottage. The vibrant colours of the centennial celebration, the bunting, the floral arrangements, and the bright summer dresses now appeared garish and out of place against the grim reality of Marcus Vane's motionless form by the sundial. While Dr. Arbuthnot performed the grim formalities of a medical examination, the guests were ushered toward the stone terrace, where the initial shock quickly curdled into a feverish, hushed energy. In Chipping Deeping, much like in any other English village, the immediate reaction to a tragedy was not always grief. More often, it was a desperate, clawing need to categorize the event through the medium of local gossip. Miss Marple sat perfectly still, her lavender wool resting in her lap, listening as the air around her became thick with the rising tide of speculation. The villagers moved in small, tight clusters, their voices dropping to that specific register of conspiratorial whisper that carries much further than a shout. To the untrained ear, it was a cacophony of confusion, but to Miss Marple, it was a familiar symphony of human nature. People were already busy building fortresses of theory to protect themselves from the chilling possibility that the killer was standing close enough to touch. It was a stroke, surely, Mrs. Gable, the butcher's wife, hissed to a circle of wide-eyed listeners near the lemonade stand. A man of his intensity, always brooding over old papers in that damp mill. It's no wonder his constitution gave way. The excitement of his own theatrics was simply too much for his heart. I saw his face turn that dreadful shade of plum just as he opened his mouth. It's a judgment, really, for trying to dig up dirt on families that have lived here since the beginning of time. Some things are meant to stay under the soil. Miss Higgins, the retired headmistress, shook her head with a sharp, bird-like snap of her neck. Nonsense, Martha. A stroke doesn't make a man clutch his throat as if he were being strangled by invisible hands. I was watching him closely from the rose trellis. He looked toward the buffet table just before he ascended the dais. He had a glass of the elderflower cordial, the one Elena Thorne insisted on bringing from the manor. If you ask me, the poor man didn't die of excitement. He died of something far more tangible, and we all know how Sir Geoffrey felt about Marcus Vane poking around the Thorne family crypt. The man looked as though he wanted to challenge Marcus to a duel every time they met in the high street. The mention of Sir Geoffrey caused a ripple of uneasy silence to spread through the group. The baronet was currently standing by the French doors, his back to the crowd, his shoulders rigid and unyielding. Lady Elena stood beside him, her face a mask of porcelain perfection, though her fingers were obsessively shredding a lace handkerchief into tiny white flakes. The gossip shifted focus with the agility of a school of minnows. It was whispered that Marcus Vane hadn't just been interested in Thorne history, he had been seen walking with Lady Elena in the Bluebell Woods more than once. The Willow Cottage secret might not have been 100 years old at all. Some suggested it might have been as fresh as last month's scandal. Miss Marple observed the local librarian, Miss Treadgold, who was hovering near the edge of the terrace. The woman was remarkably composed, her hands folded neatly in front of her, yet her gaze never strayed far from the shadows of the willow tree where the leather journal had been kicked. There was a peculiar, watchful quality to her silence. In Miss Marple's experience, the people who said the least during the initial outbreak of gossip were often the ones who knew exactly which threads were being pulled too tight. "It is quite fascinating, Alice," Miss Marple murmured to her hostess, who was fluttering about with a bottle of smelling salts, "how everyone settles on the most dramatic explanation that happens to coincide with their personal dislikes. It reminds me so much of the time the local churchwarden's cat went missing back home. Half the village was convinced it had been abducted by gypsies, and the other half swore the curate had sacrificed it in a fit of theological madness. Nobody wanted to consider that the poor creature had simply found a very comfortable spot in the baker's flour bin. We look for the tiger in the grass because we are far too frightened to look at the person holding the shears. Alice Fanshawe paused, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and excitement. But, Jane, Marcus said it was a secret that would change everything, the Thorne succession, the estate. If Geoffrey isn't the rightful heir, or if there's some stain on the name, it would destroy him. He lives for that legacy. And now Marcus is dead before he could say a word. It's like a plot from one of those dreadful shilling shockers. The truth, dear Alice, rarely needs a dais and a speech to make itself known, Miss Marple replied, her blue eyes turning toward the sundial. It usually prefers to sit quietly in a corner until someone notices it has been there all along. The gossip is merely the dust we kick up to hide the footprints. Did you notice how Dr. Arbuthnot didn't check Marcus's pulse until he had first checked the glass of cordial? And did you see how the Major moved to stand between the body and the inspector's arrival, as if he were guarding a parade ground? They aren't speculating, they are reacting to a very specific fear. As the evening light turned a bruised purple, the village of Chipping Deeping was no longer a collection of neighbours. It was a gallery of suspects, each one weaving a story that served as both an accusation and a shield. The theories grew more elaborate with every passing minute, talk of ancient poisons, secret passages, and forged wills. Yet, beneath the noise, Miss Marple sensed a deeper, more calculated silence. The secret of Willow Cottage had already claimed one life, and the village's reaction was a frantic attempt to bury it once more under a mountain of words. She realized that the gossip was the first line of defense for a killer who understood the village heart perfectly. As the police sirens finally began to wail in the distance, Miss Marple quietly picked up her knitting. She knew that the true story wasn't being told on the terrace, it was hidden in the small ignored details that the gossips were too busy to see. The arrival of Inspector Slack was, as was customary for that energetic and abrasive gentleman, a whirlwind of slamming car doors and barked orders that seemed to vibrate the very window panes of Willow Cottage. He entered the garden with his notebook already open, his sharp eyes darting about with a clinical suspicion that suggested he viewed every rosebush as a potential accomplice and every guest as a deliberate obstacle to his promotion. To Inspector Slack, a crime scene was not a puzzle of human nature or a delicate study of character. It was a series of physical facts to be bullied into a reportable shape. He immediately ordered the terrace to be cleared, a directive that sent the villagers scurrying toward the house like a flock of startled starlings, leaving the lawn to the professionals and one quiet elderly lady who seemed remarkably difficult to overlook. Miss Marple remained in her wicker chair on the periphery of the grass, her needles clicking with a soft, persistent rhythm that existed entirely outside the inspector's sphere of authority. She watched him descend upon the stone sundial, noting the way he focused almost exclusively on the overturned glass of elderflower cordial. To the inspector, the case was a matter of chemistry and mechanics. He saw the discoloured liquid and the proximity of the Thorne family, and his mind began to construct a very linear, very tidy narrative of aristocratic desperation and poisoned chalices. He spent a great deal of time measuring the distance from the buffet table to the dais, as if the secret of the murder lay in the geometry of the garden rather than the geography of the human soul. While Slack was busy with his tapes and his powders, Miss Marple's attention was drawn to a series of much smaller, quieter patterns that formed the true cross-stitching of the afternoon. She noticed that the local librarian, Miss Treadgold, had not gone inside with the others. Instead, she was standing near the edge of the laburnum hedge, her hands busy with a pair of gardening shears she had retrieved from a nearby bench. She wasn't pruning with any horticultural intent. She was systematically snipping the heads off a row of perfectly healthy marigolds. It was a rhythmic, violent movement that spoke of a profound internal agitation, yet her face remained as placid and unreadable as a millpond in winter. "It is quite remarkable, is it not?" Miss Marple remarked to a young constable stationed near the willow tree, who looked as though he would much rather be back at the station filing paperwork. How people always seek to occupy their hands when their minds are in a state of absolute upheaval. It reminds me so much of poor Mrs. Pye back in St. Mary Mead. Whenever her husband was in one of his particular moods, she would go out and weed the gravel path until her fingers bled. She wasn't interested in the weeds, you see, she was interested in the control. Miss Treadgold is doing much the same thing, I suspect. She is tidying up her emotions by ruining the garden, and she is doing it so that she doesn't have to look at the sundial. The constable looked at her with a mixture of confusion and pity, but Miss Marple's gaze had already moved on. She was looking at the long damp grass where the leather journal had been kicked by Miss Treadgold's sensible shoe. The shadows were deep there now, but she could see a faint rectangular impression in the dew, a mark that was slowly fading as the night air cooled. More importantly, she noticed a small discarded piece of paper caught in the lower branches of the weeping willow. It was not a page from the historian's journal, it was a modern receipt, the kind one receives from a chemist's shop in a much larger town than Chipping Deeping. As the inspector moved towards Sir Geoffrey to begin a formal interrogation, Miss Marple noted the baronet's footwear. He was wearing heavy brogues, suitable for a garden party, but there was a distinct smudge of bright yellow clay on the side of one heel, a type of clay that was not found in the well-drained soil of Willow Cottage, but was rampant in the excavations at the old mill where Marcus Vane had lived and worked. It was a detail that Slack, in his eagerness to find a smoking gun in a cordial glass, had completely overlooked. Why would Sir Geoffrey, a man who prided himself on his dignity and his distance from the newcomers, have been prowling around a muddy construction site? Patterns are such curious things, Miss Marple mused to herself, her needles never pausing in their work. The inspector sees the bold strokes, the poison, the public toast, the obvious rivalry between the old estate and the new historian. But he misses the fine work. He misses the way Lady Elena keeps glancing at the librarian with a look of terrified recognition, and the way the doctor keeps adjusting his medical bag, as if it were uncomfortably heavy with something other than a stethoscope. It is like an old tapestry that has been mended too many times by too many different hands. If you look at the front, you see a picture of a village festival. If you look at the back, you see the knots and the tangles, and the places where the thread has been cut. She also observed the behavior of the village historian's assistant, a quiet, scholarly young man named Peter, who had been hovering in the background like a shadow. He was currently staring at the sundial with an expression of intense, guilt-ridden fascination. He wasn't looking at Marcus Vane's body, he was looking at the base of the stone pedestal, specifically at a loose stone near the foundation. Miss Marple recalled that Marcus had mentioned a link in the thorn succession. A link suggests a chain, and a chain is only ever as strong as its weakest point. The early investigation was already falling into a predictable, unimaginative groove. Slack was convinced the cordial weapon was the weapon, and that the motive was to protect Thorn's name from a scandalous revelation. He was busy collecting samples and taking names, building a case that was as sturdy and as uninspired as a brick wall. But Miss Marple was thinking about the marigolds and the yellow clay. She realized that the secret of Willow Cottage was not just a piece of dusty history, it was a living, breathing threat that had been moving through the village for weeks. The inspector was looking for a killer who had acted in a moment of panic atop a dais, but Miss Marple suspected they were looking for someone who had been planning a very different kind of centennial for a very long time. As the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky, she realized that the most important clue wasn't something that had been added to the garden that day, but something that had been taken away. By the following morning, the sun rose over Chipping Deeping with a deceptive, indifferent brilliance, illuminating a village that had effectively been placed under siege by Inspector Slack's mounting ambitions. The inspector had established a temporary headquarters in the village hall, and by 10 o'clock he had already identified his primary target with a kind of ruthless efficiency that usually precedes a significant error in judgment. To Slack, the case was as transparent as a freshly polished window pane. He had discovered, through a series of frantic telephone calls to London, that Sir Geoffrey Thorne's financial situation was far more precarious than the family's ancient stone crest suggested. Mortgages on the manor were piling up like dead leaves in autumn, and Marcus Vane's promised revelation regarding a succession secret threatened the only thing the baronet had left, his claim to the estate and the significant life insurance policies tied to his title. I watched from a nearby bench as Sir Geoffrey was led into the hall for further questioning. He looked every bit the part of the cornered aristocrat, his tweed jacket rumpled, his face a mask of rigid crimson indignation. To the inspector, this was the face of a guilty man desperate to maintain a crumbling façade. To me, however, it looked remarkably like the face of poor Mr. Ebbs from St. Mary Mead, who always looked incredibly guilty when he hadn't done anything at all, simply because he was so terrified of being thought ill of by the neighbours. It is a very common trait in men of a certain standing. They find the accusation of a crime far more insulting than the crime itself. It is also very brisk and businesslike, is it not, Alice? I remarked to my hostess, who had joined me on the bench, looking quite frail in the morning light and clutching a damp handkerchief. The inspector is so very fond of a tidy solution. He sees the obvious rivalry and the financial pressure, and he decides the puzzle is finished before he has even looked at all the pieces. It reminds me so much of the time the local draper was accused of stealing the church silver because he had been seen lurking near the vestry with a heavy, suspicious bag. Everyone was quite convinced of his guilt until it was discovered the bag was full of nothing but his own damp laundry that he was too embarrassed to hang on the line. People do so love to point a finger at the most prominent person in the room because it makes their own lives feel so much more orderly. Alice sighed, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and a very human sort of excitement. But Jane, everyone saw how Geoffrey reacted. He was practically vibrating with rage when Marcus stood up on that dais. And Marcus's assistant, that quiet boy Peter, told the police that Sir Geoffrey had visited the mill 3 nights ago in a towering passion. They had a shouting match that could be heard all the way across the river. Peter says Geoffrey threatened to silence Marcus if he didn't hand over that leather journal immediately. It sounds so very definitive, does it not? A man who threatens to silence someone in a shouting match, Alice, is rarely the man who actually does it with a glass of elderflower cordial, I replied, my needles beginning their steady rhythmic clicking once more. Murderers, in my experience, are usually much more polite, at least until the very last moment. They prefer to blend into the wallpaper and offer you a second piece of cake. Sir Geoffrey is far too much like a bull in a china shop. He breaks things loudly and then wonders why everyone is looking at him. He doesn't wait for a public toast to do his dirty work. He is a man of temper, not a man of cold, calculated precision. My scepticism was not merely a matter of temperament. I was thinking of Lady Elena, who had arrived at the hall separately from her husband. The baronet's wife was draped in expensive silk that shimmered in the morning light, but I noticed that she was wearing a pair of old, scuffed walking shoes that were entirely out of character for her meticulously curated appearance. More importantly, those shoes bore the faint, dried remnants of the same bright yellow clay I had noticed on Sir Geoffrey's brogues the night before. If they had both been at the mill, then the secret Marcus Vane held was a threat to the marriage, not just the money. The inspector's obvious case was also leaning heavily on Peter, the historian's assistant. Slack viewed him as the star witness, the young, earnest scholar who had been cowed by the powerful, bullying baronet. But I had seen the way Peter looked at Miss Treadgold, the librarian, when he thought the police were not watching. There was a look of shared, desperate understanding between the two of them that did not fit the narrative of a simple aristocratic crime. Furthermore, the leather journal was still missing. Slack assumed Sir Geoffrey had disposed of it in the river, but I knew exactly where it had been nudged by a sensible shoe. The inspector is looking for a villain in a melodrama, I mused to myself, my eyes following a stray pigeon as it hopped across the cobbles. He sees the angry baronet and the secret inheritance, and he thinks he has found the heart of the matter. But he is ignoring the chemist's receipt I found in the willow branches. He is ignoring how marigolds were beheaded with such surgical precision. He is looking for a motive that involves millions of pounds, when in a village like Chipping Deeping, the most lethal motives are often much smaller and far more personal. A bit of pride, a bit of fear, or perhaps the desire to keep a very small private world from changing in a way that cannot be undone. I watched as Dr. Arbuthnot arrived at the hall, looking weary and carrying his medical bag with a certain protective clench of his fingers. He had been the one to provide the elderflower cordial as a gift from his own garden, and Slack was already beginning to view him with a secondary suspicion, perhaps as an unwilling accomplice to the Thorne family's desperation. But I remembered the way the doctor had looked at Marcus Vane's face before he even touched the body. It wasn't the look of a man discovering a crime, it was the look of a man confirming a diagnosis he had already made in the quiet of his own surgery. Human nature is so very rarely about the money in the way the police imagine, I whispered to the lavender wool in my lap. It is almost always about the person we imagine ourselves to be. Sir Geoffrey imagines himself a protector of the past, but he is too clumsy for the task. The person who killed Marcus Vane didn't use a hammer, they used a needle, and they used the inspector's own eagerness for a quick result to ensure that the bull would be the one to take the blame for the broken china. As Slack emerged from the hall, looking smug and holding a warrant, I adjusted my shawl. He was about to make a very official and very wrong arrest, and I realized it was time for me to pay a visit to the library. The Chipping Deeping Library was a structure of ancient honey-coloured stone that smelled of damp parchment, beeswax, and the peculiar, dry scent of a century of silence. It was a place where the air felt thick with the presence of the past, and where every footfall on the warped floorboards sounded like a colonial reprimand. I entered the building with a quiet, apologetic smile, my knitting bag over my arm and my eyes moving with bird-like precision across the shelves. Miss Treadgold, the librarian, was perched behind the heavy oak circulation desk, her hands busy with a stack of filing cards. The sunlight filtered through the stained glass windows, casting long, multicolored slashes across the room, but the atmosphere remained stubbornly cold, as if the building itself were holding its breath. "Good morning, Miss Treadgold," I said, my voice a gentle, rhythmic warble that I hoped would not disturb the ecclesiastical quiet of the stacks. I was wondering if I might have a look at the village records for the year 1896. I have a sudden, silly interest in ward boundaries. It is so very tragic about poor Mr. Vane, is it not? Such a clever man. It reminds me so much of the time the local postmaster back home was found collapsed in his garden. Everyone thought it was his heart, but it turned out to be a very unfortunate reaction to the new brand of fertilizer he was using. We are all so fragile in the end, and we often find trouble where we least expect it. Miss Treadgold did not look up immediately. She continued to file her cards with a mechanical, rhythmic snapping sound that echoed the sharp snip of the marigolds I had witnessed the previous afternoon. "Death is always tragic, Miss Marple, but Mr. Vane was a man who lived among the dead. Maybe he just got too entangled. Some people do not understand that the past is meant to be respected, not interrogated. The 1896 records are in the back behind the Thorne family collection. They haven't been touched in years, and I should think they are quite dusty." I moved toward the indicated shelf, but my attention was not on the thick, dust-covered ledgers that promised a history of land disputes and tithes. Instead, my gaze was fixed on a very small, seemingly unimportant detail on the librarian's desk. There was a small, circular wooden stand used for the library's date stamp, and beside it lay a pair of reading glasses. One of the lenses had a tiny, almost microscopic smudge of yellow clay on the rim. the very same bright, distinctive clay that had marred the shoes of Sir Geoffrey and Lady Elena. But it was the object next to the glasses that truly caught my eye, a small silver-plated spoon with a peculiarly shaped handle, the kind used for measuring out very specific medicinal powders, or perhaps the fine sugar one might take with a specific kind of tea. "How curious," I murmured, leaning in as if to admire an antique binding while actually observing the residue on the spoon, that little spoon. "It has such a distinctive crest. It looks almost like the one on the thorn silverware I saw yesterday, yet it is slightly different, is it not? It reminds me of the time the apothecary's assistant in St. Mary Mead was found to be borrowing the labels from the expensive tonics to put on his own homemade remedies. He thought no one would notice the subtle difference in the engraving, but the eyes of an old lady are very difficult to deceive when it comes to domestic details." Miss Treadgold's hand paused in mid-air. The snapping sound of the filing cards stopped abruptly, leaving a silence that felt heavy and expectant. She looked at me then, her face a mask of waxy ecclesiastical calm, but her eyes were hard behind her spectacles. "It is a commemorative spoon, Miss Marple, a gift from the Thorne family during the library's founding. It has been on this desk for 30 years. I use it for my afternoon sugar, as I have always done. There is nothing mysterious about a spoon in a library." I nodded, my expression one of mild, grandmotherly agreement. "Of course, dear, of course." But I couldn't help but notice something else. When I was sitting in the garden yesterday, I saw a very small bird, a robin, I believe, trying to pick up a fragment of something near the willow tree. It was a tiny piece of blue glass, no larger than a ladybird. And it occurred to me that I saw a very similar blue glass bottle in the doctor's medical bag earlier that day. He said it was a heart tonic for his own nerves, but the bottle I saw on his desk this morning when I passed the surgery was green. People are so very careless with their bottles when they are in a hurry, don't you think? The librarian's eyes narrowed, a flash of something cold and sharp appearing behind her spectacles. "The doctor is a very busy man, especially now. He is prone to misplacing things. If you are looking for secrets, Miss Marple, you would do better to look in the books, not in the refuse of a medical bag. This library contains everything one needs to know about the integrity of this village." I turned my back to the desk and pulled a heavy volume from the shelf. As I did, I noticed a small, discarded piece of blotting paper caught between the pages of the 1896 record. It was an ordinary enough object, but this particular piece had a very specific rectangular indentation on it, as if something heavy and sharp-edged had been pressed into it recently, something precisely the size of a leather-bound journal. More importantly, the blotting paper bore a faint greenish stain that smelled unmistakably of crushed cherry laurel leaves. It was a scent I knew well from the gardens of St. Mary Mead. It was the scent of cyanide in its most primitive garden-grown form. This was the detail that everyone had missed. Inspector Slack was looking for a military poison or a dramatic aristocratic strike. He was focused on cordial and shouting matches at the mill. But I was thinking about the Willow Cottage secret. If Marcus Vane had found a link in the Thorne succession that proved the current line was illegitimate, who would have the most to lose? Not just Sir Geoffrey, whose pride would be shattered, but the person whose entire life was built on the preservation and curation of that history. Miss Treadgold was the guardian of the Thorne records. She was the one who managed the village's sense of itself. If the records were proven to be a lie, her own 30 years of meticulous work would be rendered meaningless, a footnote in a scandal. Human nature is so remarkably consistent, I mused to myself, tucking the piece of blotting paper into my sleeve as I replaced the book. People will go to extraordinary lengths to protect the dignity of the dead, especially when it is the only thing that gives the living any purpose. The inspector is looking for a killer with a smoking gun, but I suspect we are looking for someone with a very quiet, very efficient sense of duty. Someone who knows exactly how many laurel leaves it takes to make a heart tonic that stops a man's breath while he is in the middle of a speech. I looked back at Miss Treadgold, who was now systematically destroying a stack of old library cards, her shears making a sharp rhythmic sound that echoed the decapitated marigolds once more. The minor detail was no longer minor, it was a signature. The clay on the glasses, the silver spoon, and the smell of cherry laurel pointed to a crime that was not born of greed, but of a terrifying obsessive devotion to a century-old fiction. I realized then that the leather journal hadn't been stolen by the baronet, it had been filed away by someone who believed that some secrets were too dangerous to ever be read aloud. As I left the library and entered the pale afternoon sun, I knew the final test was ready. I needed to make the killer believe that Marcus Vane's assistant had found a second copy of that devastating journal. The afternoon sun had retreated behind a bank of bruised, heavy clouds, casting the drawing room of Willow Cottage into a premature and sombre twilight. I sat in my usual high-backed chair, my knitting needles clicking with a soft, persistent rhythm that seemed to be the only thing keeping the room's rising tension from boiling over into a state of absolute chaos. Alice Fanshawe hovered by the tea tray, her hands trembling so violently that the china clattered like castanets against the silver. Opposite us sat Lady Elena Thorne, her silk dress rustling with every sharp, agitated movement of her limbs, and Peter, the young assistant to the late Marcus Vane, who looked as though he had aged 10 years since the previous evening. The air was thick with the scent of wood smoke and the metallic tang of unvoiced fear, a combination I have always found particularly conducive to the unravelling of human secrets. "It is quite remarkable," I began, my voice a gentle rhythmic hum that seemed to mimic the swaying of the willow tree outside, "how a single tragedy can peel back the layers of a village like an onion. We all thought we knew the Thorne family, did we not? We saw the grand manor, the ancient name, and the impeccable dignity of Sir Geoffrey. But a family name is often like a beautiful piece of embroidery. The front is all flowers and symmetry, but the back is a tangle of knots and messy threads. Marcus Vane was a man who lived to turn the embroidery over and look at the knots, and I fear he found more than he bargained for." Lady Elena's eyes flashed with a sudden, cold fire that was entirely at odds with her usual delicate composure. "Marcus Vane was a predator, Miss Marple. He didn't care about history. He cared about the power that comes from destroying it. He spent his days digging through our lives as if we were nothing more than curiosities in a museum. He had no right to suggest our legacy was pure. My husband's family has served this county for generations, and Marcus wanted to turn that service into a scandal for the sake of a few headlines in a historical journal. He was a small man trying to make himself look large by standing on the ruins of others. And yet," I said softly, my blue eyes looking up with a piercing clarity that made Lady Elena flinch despite her bravado, "it wasn't just ancient history he was digging into, was it, my dear? I noticed you wearing a pair of very sensible muddy shoes this morning when you arrived at the village hall, quite unlike your usual elegant footwear, and I noticed the yellow clay on them, the same clay that is found in the excavations at the old mill. You weren't just protecting the Thorne name from a 100-year-old secret, you were protecting yourself from a much more modern one. You were seen with Marcus in the Bluebell Woods more than once, were you not? And I suspect you weren't discussing the restoration of the monarchy." The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by a sharp, strangled gasp from Peter. The young man stood up abruptly, his face ashen, his hands gripping the back of his chair until his knuckles were white. "She was trying to buy him off," he cried, his voice breaking with a mixture of anger and a very deep grief. Marcus wasn't a predator, he was a man who had found a truth that was too heavy for him to carry alone. He told me that Lady Elena had offered him a substantial sum from her personal jewellery collection to lose the journal. But it wasn't an affair. Marcus didn't care about her personal life. He had found proof that the Thorne line ended in 1896, that the child born that year, the one Geoffrey descends from, was not a Thorne at all, but the son of a village girl and a travelling merchant, adopted to prevent the estate from passing to a distant, disliked cousin. "That is a lie," Lady Elena hissed, though her voice lacked its usual conviction. and her hands began to shred her lace handkerchief into tiny white flakes. "Geoffrey is a thorn in every sense of the word. He lives on that estate. If he found out he was a fraud, he wouldn't just lose his title, he would lose his very soul. I went to the mill to plead for his sanity, not to hide a tawdry's secret. I love my husband, Miss Marple. I would do anything to protect him from a man who wanted to kill him with the truth. Love makes people do things they never thought possible." I nodded, my expression one of mild, grandmotherly compassion. Love and protection are very powerful motives, Lady Elena. They are the soil where the most dangerous secrets grow. "But you weren't the only one visiting the mill, were you? Peter, you were Marcus's friend, yet you were the one who told the inspector about the shouting match between Marcus and Sir Geoffrey with such helpful detail. You directed the police toward the baronet with a very suspicious eagerness. It reminds me so much of the time the curate in St. Mary Mead was found to be stealing from the poor box. He was always the first to point the finger at the local ne'er-do-well, hoping that by making a loud noise in one direction, no one would look on his own." Peter sank back into his chair, his eyes fixed on his boots. "I wanted justice for Marcus. I knew Sir Geoffrey had the most to lose. I didn't think anyone would look at me. I'm just an assistant. I didn't have a motive to kill the man who was my mentor. Why would I destroy my own future?" "But you did, Peter," I replied, my needles beginning a slow, deliberate click-clack that felt like the ticking of a clock. "You had the motive of a man being blackmailed. Marcus had found more than just a thorn secret. He had found that his own assistant had been systematically removing rare documents from the archives to sell to private collectors in London. The librarian, Miss Treadgold, had noticed the gaps in the collection and had informed Marcus. He was going to expose you right after the centennial speech. You weren't protecting the Thorn name, you were protecting your own skin. You wanted the baronet to take the blame for a crime you hoped would look like an act of aristocratic desperation. The room was now a gallery of exposed souls, each trapped in a web of their own making. The secrets of Willow Cottage were no longer hidden. They were laid out like the flowers at the festival, each one bearing the faint, sickly scent of decay. I noted that Alice Fanshawe had gone quite pale, her eyes darting between the suspects with a look of profound, hollow realization. The motives were as tangled as the roots of the willow tree outside: greed, love, pride, and the desperate clinging need for social preservation. Human beings are so very much like spiders. We weave these intricate webs of protection and convenience, and then we are genuinely horrified when someone tries to sweep them away with the broom of truth. I realized that Marcus Vane hadn't died because of one secret, but because he had become the intersection of too many. But while they were all busy guarding their own corners, a much more efficient hand had been at work in the shadows. The patterns were shifting again, and I realized that the true deception was even more subtle than a husband's pride or an assistant's greed. I adjusted my shawl and looked toward the window, watching the first droplets of rain begin to streak the glass. Another twist was coming, and it would prove that the most dangerous person in the village was the one who believed they were the only one who truly cared about the sanctity of the past. The following morning, the fragile peace of chipping deeping was shattered not by a scream, but by the cold, mechanical sound of a locksmith's drill echoing through the ancient stone walls of the village library. Inspector Slack, fueled by a night of mounting frustration and the realization that his case against Sir Geoffrey was beginning to fray at the edges, had ordered a formal search of the premises. His justification was a sudden anonymous tip claiming that Marcus Vane's missing leather journal had been seen being carried into the library under a dark shawl shortly after the murder. To Slack, this was a breakthrough. To me, as I watched from a safe distance across the street while ostensibly shopping for a very specific shade of lavender wool, it was a masterstroke of misdirection. The search yielded an immediate and shocking result that seemed to turn the entire investigation on its head. Hidden behind a row of Victorian encyclopedias, police uncovered a small, ornate blue glass bottle. When Dr. Arbuthnot was summoned to examine it, his face turned a sickly shade of grey. It was his own missing heart tonic bottle, the one he had reported lost 2 days prior. However, the liquid inside was no longer a medicinal heart tonic. It was a concentrated home-brewed extract of cherry laurel, a substance known to mimic the effects of a sudden, fatal respiratory collapse if administered in a high enough dose. Beside the bottle was a single lace-trimmed handkerchief bearing the initials E.T. and a small, hastily scrawled note that appeared to be a confession of unrequited love for the late Marcus Vane, signed with the same initials. The village reacted with a collective gasp of disbelief that quickly curdled into a feverish hunt for the local librarian. To the inspector, the twist was perfect. It shifted the focus away from the Thorne family and provided a classic sensational motive of jealousy and spurned affection. He concluded that Miss Treadgold, the quiet spinster librarian, had been secretly in love with the handsome historian and had killed him in a fit of rage when she discovered his liaison with Lady Elena. It was a story that fit every stereotype of village life, and the police were eager to close the case by arresting the woman who had suddenly disappeared from her post at the circulation desk. I stood by the haberdashery window, my brow furrowed in deep thought. I remembered the blue bottle I had seen in the doctor's bag and the green one I had seen later in his surgery. I also remembered the way the confession note had been described, placed perfectly, without a single smudge of ink or a tear of distress. It was too tidy, too staged, like a scene in a poorly directed play. It was exactly the sort of evidence someone would plant if they wanted to satisfy an inspector's love for a dramatic romantic motive. "It is quite remarkable," I remarked to the haberdasher, who was busy gossiping about the librarian's secret passion, "how a piece of blue glass can change the entire direction of a person's thoughts. It reminds me so much of the time the local schoolmaster in St. Mary Mead was accused of stealing the church funds. A forged letter was found in his desk, dripping with guilt and sentiment. Everyone believed it because they wanted to believe he had a secret life. But the letter had been written by the real thief, who knew the schoolmaster would never defend himself because he was too proud to admit he had been duped. The more obvious the evidence, the more I find myself looking at who benefited from it being found. While the police were busy searching the woods for Miss Treadgold, I was thinking about the handwriting on that note. It was a perfect copperplate script, the kind taught in finishing schools 50 years ago. But Miss Treadgold, for all her quiet ways, was a woman of the modern age who had been trained in a very different, more utilitarian style of filing and record-keeping. The handkerchief, too, was an old-fashioned accessory, the sort of thing a lady of a certain standing would keep tucked in her sleeve. It didn't belong to a working librarian who spent her days among dusty books and ink stamps. The twist had successfully reinforced the killer's deception by providing a new, emotionally charged narrative that drew attention away from the Thorne's succession and the assistant's greed. It made the librarian the villain of a tragic romance, a role that the village was only too happy to cast her in. But I realized that the true killer was using the librarian as a shield. The disappearance of Miss Treadgold wasn't a flight of guilt. It was a calculated removal of the only person who knew the truth about the Thorne lineage and the missing documents. The killer was doubling down, providing the inspector with exactly what he wanted, a clear motive and a missing suspect, while the real crime lay buried in a book that had never been checked out. I noted how Lady Elena had reacted to the news of the discovery. There was no relief on her face, only a deepening hollow terror. She knew that the librarian wouldn't have killed for Marcus Vane, she would have killed for the library itself. But the librarian was gone, and the blue bottle was in the inspector's hand. The stage was set for the final act, and I knew I had to act quickly before the village reaction turned into a permanent and incorrect judgment. I watched as Dr. Arbuthnot left the library, his medical bag gripped tightly in his hand, his eyes darting toward the Thorne Manor with a look of profound, silent warning. The patterns are shifting, I mused to myself. my needles finally returning to their steady work as I sat back at Alice's window. The inspector thinks he is at the end of the road, but he is actually at the entrance of a very clever maze. The blue bottle is a signature, but it is forged. The real killer is someone who knows the doctor's habits, the librarian's records, and the baronet's pride. Someone who is currently sitting very quietly, perhaps waiting for the afternoon post, believing that the Willow Cottage secret has finally been buried under a blue glass bottle and a forged note of love. I realized then that I needed to find Miss Treadgold before the police did, but not for the reason the inspector thought. I needed the librarian to tell me about the 1896 entry and about the person who had been so eager to ensure it was never read by a living soul. The afternoon mist began to thicken, curling around the stone pedestals of the village square like a cold grey sea that sought to swallow the very foundations of Chipping Deeping. I sat in the small, glass-fronted conservatory of the village inn, a location that offered an unobstructed view of the entrance to the Thorne family solicitor's office. My knitting was tucked away, replaced by a small leather-bound volume of poetry that I was not actually reading, though I made a show of turning the pages with rhythmic regularity. My focus was entirely on the man sitting across from me, his face illuminated by the dim, watery light, Dr. Arbuthnot. The doctor had been summoned to the inn under the pretext of checking on my fluttering heart, a condition I had described with such convincing fragility over the telephone that the busy man had felt obligated to stop by between his rounds. He sat now with his medical bag at his feet, his fingers drumming a nervous, uneven rhythm on the small mahogany table that separated us. "It is such a comfort to see you, Doctor," I began, my voice a gentle rhythmic warble that seemed to blend with the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. In times of such social upheaval, one feels the need for a steady hand. Chipping Deeping has become quite a different place since that dreadful afternoon at Alice's. It reminds me so much of the time the old colonel in St. Mary Mead was found to have been living a double life. Everyone was so shocked, yet the signs were all there. The way he always checked the post before his wife, the specific brand of tobacco he only bought in London. We see what we expect to see until the pattern is broken by a single sharp truth that we can no longer ignore. "Doctor." Arbuthnot looked at me, his eyes weary and slightly bloodshot behind his spectacles. "The pattern is broken indeed, Miss Marple. The police have their evidence. The librarian's disappearance and that blue bottle, it seems tragic human motive has finally emerged from the shadows. I only wish I had noticed the poor woman's distress sooner. A doctor should be more observant of the mental state of his patients, especially those who spend so much time alone with their books and their thoughts. It is a heavy burden to realize one has missed the symptoms of a breaking heart." "Oh, but you were observant, Doctor," I said, leaning forward slightly, my blue eyes reflecting the grey light with a sudden, startling clarity that seemed to catch him off guard. "You were the first to notice that Marcus Vane was not having a stroke. You checked the cordial pitcher before you even reached the body, which was a very sensible thing to do, and you noticed your own heart tonic bottle was missing long before the police found it hidden in the library. But what I find most curious is the handkerchief found with the bottle. The initials E.T. were so very neatly embroidered. It reminded me of the way you used to insist that your nurse, Miss Evans, label all your surgical linens before she retired last year. Her name was Elizabeth Thorne Evans, was it not? A distant, poorer relation to the Thorne family who felt the weight of her heritage more than most. The doctor's hand stopped its drumming. The room became deathly still, the only sound the distant, muffled bark of a dog somewhere in the village street. He didn't look away, but a small muscle in his jaw began to pulse with a life of its own. "Elizabeth was a dedicated nurse," he said, his voice flat and devoid of its usual professional warmth. "Her family history was her own business, and she was very private about it. I fail to see what an old nurse who has been in her grave for months has to do with Marcus Vane's death or Miss Treadgold's unfortunate disappearance. "It has everything to do with it, Doctor," I continued, my voice remaining soft, almost conversational. "You see, Marcus Vane hadn't just found a secret about the Thorne succession. He had found the person who had been protecting that secret for 30 years. He had found that you, the trusted village doctor, had been the one to sign the forged birth certificates and the altered death records in 1896. You didn't do it for money, you did it for Elizabeth. She was the one who loved the Thorne name more than life itself, and she couldn't bear to see the estate fall to a man she considered a degenerate outsider. You helped her preserve the fiction, and when she died you continued to guard it, not for the current Sir Geoffrey, but for the memory of the woman you loved with such quiet, desperate devotion." I paused, watching for the response I knew must come. The doctor didn't jump or cry out. Instead, he seemed to collapse inwardly, his shoulders sagging as if a great weight had finally settled upon them. He reached for his medical bag, his knuckles white against the dark leather. "Marcus Vane was going to ruin everything Elizabeth worked for," Arbuthnot whispered, his gaze fixed on the floor. "He was going to publish those names. He was going to turn a life of sacrifice and dignity into a footnote in a scandalous history book. I couldn't let him do it. The librarian found the discrepancy in the ledger too, and she was going to help him. She was always too principled for her own good, and she didn't understand that some truths are more harmful than lies. The psychological murder game is tiring, right, Doctor? You planted the blue bottle and the note to frame Miss Treadgold, knowing the inspector would love a romantic motive. You even used poor Elizabeth's old handkerchief to make it look authentic. But you made one very small, very human mistake. When you moved through the garden on the day of the party, you didn't realize that the yellow clay from the mill excavations was still on your boots from your secret visit to Marcus the night before. You were the one who visited him to plead for the journal, not Sir Geoffrey. And when he refused, you decided the centenary toast would be his last. You are a man of medicine, Doctor, and you knew exactly how to make a heart stop." The doctor looked up then, and for a moment the mask of the professional healer was gone, replaced by the hollow, haunted eyes of a man who had lost his way in a maze of his own making. He looked at the conservatory door and then back at me. He knew that the inspector was likely waiting in the hallway, alerted by the very note I had suggested the constable deliver to verify the medical evidence. "You are a very dangerous woman, Jane Marple," he said, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. "You look at the world as if it were a village shop, and you notice every missing penny. It is not the pennies I notice, Doctor," I replied, my voice filled with a profound, somber clarity. "It is the people who think they can pay for their happiness with someone else's life. You didn't kill Marcus for the Thorne family. You killed him because you couldn't bear to admit that the woman you loved had built her life on a lie. And poor Miss Treadgold, I suspect she isn't in the woods at all. I suspect she is in the cellar of your old surgery, waiting for a tonic that would ensure she never speaks again." The doctor's hand tightened on the handle of his bag, his eyes darting toward the exit, but the sound of heavy boots in the hallway told him that the game was over. I sat back, my blue eyes tired but resolute. I had watched the critical reaction, the silent confession of a man who had loved a ghost more than the living. I had seen the same thing happen with the butcher's brother years ago. The secret was out, and the truth had finally cleared the mist. The drawing-room of Willow Cottage was bathed in the amber glow of a setting sun that refused to acknowledge the grim purpose of the gathering. Inspector Slack stood by the fireplace, his chest puffed out with a triumphant air that I knew was entirely premature, while Sir Geoffrey and Lady Elena sat together on the sofa, looking like two people who had survived a shipwreck only to find themselves on an island of thorns. Alice Fanshawe hovered near the tea service, her hands still trembling as she performed the familiar domestic rites that usually offered comfort but now only served to highlight the chilling silence of the room. Into this atmosphere of settled judgment and premature conclusions, I entered with my knitting bag over my arm, my movements quiet and deliberate as I took my accustomed seat near the window. "Inspector," I began, my voice a soft but resolute chime that seemed to cut through the heavy air of the study. I'm so very grateful you could spare a moment before you make your final report. I know you are a man of facts, and facts are so very important when a life is at stake. But sometimes, in our haste to build a case, we fail to notice that the facts have been arranged for us, much like the flowers in a funeral wreath. We have all been looking at the Willow Cottage secret as if it were a matter of ancient history, a grand aristocratic conspiracy involving hidden heirs and forged successions. But the truth is much closer to home, and far more tragic. It is a mystery not of greed, but of a very long and very lonely devotion that eventually turned into a lethal obsession. Slack snorted, crossing his arms over his chest with an air of practiced, professional skepticism. Now look here, Miss Marple. The case is closed. We have the blue bottle, scribbled note, and missing librarian. It's a classic case of spurned affection and feminine jealousy. Miss Treadgold was in over her head with Van, and she used the doctor's stolen tonic to end it before he could expose her feelings to the village. What more is there to say that hasn't already been written in the charge sheet? It's all very tidy, and I don't see why you're trying to complicate a straight line. There is the matter of the yellow clay, Inspector, I replied, my blue eyes turning toward him with a piercing clarity that made him shift uncomfortably on the hearthrug. You found the clay on Sir Geoffrey's shoes and assumed he was the one prowling around the mill excavations. But you didn't look at the doctor's boots. Dr. Arbuthnot has been a village fixture for 30 years. He goes everywhere, and no one thinks to ask why he might be standing in the mud at midnight. He visited Marcus Vane the night before the centennial, not to threaten him about the Thorne name, but to plead for the legacy of Elizabeth Thorne Evans, the woman he loved for half a lifetime. Elizabeth was the one who truly orchestrated the secret 100 years ago, or rather her family did, and she inherited the burden of keeping the Thorne line pure. She was a woman who believed the name was a sacred trust, and the doctor became the silent partner in her obsession. I turned my gaze toward the small silver-plated spoon that sat on the side table, the one I had observed in the library. The weapon was not just the elderflower cordial, Inspector. It was the administration of it. You see, the person who killed Marcus Vane didn't need to spike a pitcher in front of a dozen witnesses. They needed a moment of distraction and a very specific tool. When Marcus clutched his throat, we all assumed it was the liquid he had just tasted. But I noticed something about that spoon. It had been used to measure a very concentrated extract of cherry laurel, which the doctor had been preparing under the guise of a heart tonic. He didn't steal his own bottle, he planted it to frame the librarian. He used Miss Treadgold as a scapegoat, because he knew she had found the altered records in the 1896 ledger, the very records he had helped to falsify for Elizabeth decades ago. The room was silent as the weight of my words settled, the rhythmic click of my needles providing the only heartbeat to the scene. The note in the library was a masterpiece of creative fiction, Inspector, I continued, my voice steady. It was written in a copperplate script that belonged to the 19th century, not to a modern woman like Miss Treadgold. It was written by the doctor, using the style he had seen in Elizabeth's own diaries for years. He used her old handkerchief, the one with the E.T. initials, to seal the deception. He wanted to provide you with a motive that was so romantic and sensational that you wouldn't look at the clinical reality of the crime. He knew your temperament, Inspector. He knew you wouldn't be able to resist a story of a woman scorned. I stood up slowly, my small figure suddenly commanding the room. It is the little things that tell the story, Inspector. A chemist's receipt for neutralizing agents caught in a willow tree, a smudge of clay on a pair of reading glasses, a silver spoon that didn't belong in a desk drawer. People always think that to commit a great crime, one must have a grand sweeping plan. But murder in a village is almost always a domestic affair, born of a long simmering resentment, or a desperate, clinging need to protect the past. Dr. Arbuthnot didn't kill for money, He killed to prevent Marcus Vane from turning Elizabeth's life of sacrifice into a footnote in a scandal. He killed a ghost, and he was prepared to let the librarian hang for it. The doctor didn't cry out. He didn't protest his innocence. He simply looked at me with a profound, hollow realization, his face a mask of weary, grey exhaustion. "She was the only thing that mattered, Jane," he whispered, his voice a dry, rasping thread that barely disturbed the air. "Elizabeth gave her life to this village. Marcus Vane was going to make her a villain. I had to protect her. I have watched him leave the study in the custody of the sergeant, his head bowed, a man who had finally run out of secrets. The reveal had transformed the study from a place of comfort to a gallery of revealed truths. I sat back down, the lavender wool moving through my fingers once more. The Willow Cottage secret was finally explained, but it wasn't the history of a baronet that had told the story. It was the silent, star-shaped smudge of a man who had tried to preserve a phantom and had ended up poisoning the living. The morning of the departure was characterized by that particular kind of stillness that only an English village can produce after a great and terrible storm has finally spent its fury. Chipping Deeping seemed to have shrunk. Under the weight of the week's revelations, the honey-coloured stone cottages huddled closer together, as if trying to shield themselves from the prying eyes of the outside world. The colourful bunting from the centennial celebration still hung listlessly from the eaves of the parish hall, but the wind had frayed the edges, and the once vibrant reds and golds now looked faded and weary, like the remnants of a party that no one wanted to remember. The village library was closed, a heavy iron padlock securing the door where Miss Treadgold had once meticulously filed the lives of her neighbours. The centre of the village's social gravity had been removed, and in its place was a hollow, echoing silence that not even the cheerful chirping of the garden birds could fully dispel. Miss Jane Marple stood on the platform of the small railway station, her suitcase neatly packed and her knitting bag resting in the crook of her arm. She was waiting for the 10:42 to London, which would eventually deliver her back to the familiar comforting routines of St Mary Mead. She watched as a black police car drove slowly past the station entrance, a sight that had become all too common in Chipping Deeping over the last 48 hours. Inside, she knew, were the final statements and final reports that would seal Doctor's fate. Arbuthnot, the man who had been the village's healer, was now its greatest tragedy, a reminder that the most dangerous secrets are often those kept out of a misplaced sense of loyalty. "It is a very sombre business, Jane," Alice Fanshawe said, having accompanied her friend to the station to see her off. She dabbed at her eyes with a lace handkerchief, her movements still somewhat shaky from the shock of seeing the doctor led away in handcuffs. "To think that we all lived alongside such a dark current for 30 years. Dr. Arbuthnot was the first person we called for a birth, a fever, or a passing. And all that time he was carrying the weight of that forged history and the memory of Elizabeth Thorne Evans. It makes one feel so very vulnerable, as if the very ground beneath our feet isn't quite as solid as we imagined. I don't think I shall ever be able to walk past the old surgery again without feeling a shiver of dread. It really does make one lose faith in the neighbours." Miss Marple looked at her friend with a look that was compassionate and deeply realistic. "It is the tragedy of the well enough, dear Alice. We spend our lives pretending that the cracks in the wall aren't there, and then we are surprised when the whole structure collapses because someone pointed at a loose stone. Dr. Arbuthnot didn't kill for himself, he killed for an idea. He loved the institution of Elizabeth's memory more than the morality it was built upon. It is a very common human failing, though rarely taken to such a lethal extreme. It reminds me so much of poor Mr. Benchley back home, who once suppressed a legitimate inheritance just because he thought the rightful heir had untidy fingernails and wouldn't look after the family portraits properly. People will justify almost any cruelty if they believe they are serving a higher aesthetic or social order. The train whistle echoed through the valley, a sharp, modern sound that seemed to signal the definitive end of the Willow Cottage mystery. Miss Marple rose, smoothing her tweed skirt and adjusting her hat with a practiced hand. She thought of Sir Geoffrey, whose pride would now have to contend with the public knowledge of his line's illegitimacy, and Lady Elena, whose efforts to protect her husband had only served to complicate the tragedy. The village had been stripped bare, its secrets exposed to the harsh light of the law, and now it would have to find a way to rebuild itself on something more substantial than a collection of comfortable lies. The Willow Cottage secret would remain a part of local legend for generations to come, a cautionary tale about the cost of living in the past. "I suppose we shall have to find a new librarian as well," Alice sighed, looking toward the village spire. "But it won't be the same. The trust is gone, Jane. We shall all be looking at each other over the tea table and wondering what else is hidden in the bottom of the sugar bowl. Miss Treadgold is safe, thank goodness, but she says she can never work in that building again. She feels as though the books themselves were complicit in the silence. It is as if the frost has come early this year and touched everything with a bit of ice." "And that, I'm afraid, is the price of the truth," Miss Marple replied, stepping toward the arriving train. "It is a cold comfort, but it is a comfort nonetheless. One cannot live in a house of mirrors forever. Eventually the glass must break so we can see the world as it truly is. Chipping Deeping will recover, but it will be a different place, a more honest place perhaps, even if it is a little less tidy. We often find that once the Willow Cottage secret is told, the cottage itself feels much lighter for the telling. The truth is like a good spring cleaning. It is very disruptive while it is happening, but everything feels much fresher once the dust has been settled." As the train pulled away, Miss Marple watched the village recede into the distance. She saw the green, the manor on the hill, and the distant gleam of the river. She felt a profound sense of weariness, the familiar weight of seeing the worst of humanity tucked away behind the best of intentions. But as she opened her knitting bag and retrieved her lavender wool, she felt a small, quiet spark of hope. Human nature was consistent in its failings, yes, but it was also consistent in its resilience. She began to knit, the needles clicking a steady rhythm against the motion of the train, her mind already turning toward the roses in her own garden, which she hoped had survived the recent heat without her. She thought of the doctor's final look, not one of hatred, but of a strange, empty relief. The burden of the lie had been heavier than the gallows threat. As the train gathered speed, leaving the shadows of the willow trees behind, Miss Marple closed her eyes for a moment, listening to the world move on. The mystery was over, the threads were tied, and Chipping Deeping would have to learn to live with the truth one day at a time. She had done what she could, not with a magnifying glass, but with the simple, devastating power of observation and an understanding of the human heart's infinite capacity for self-deception.